going to go ahead and get started here. So, first of all, mic check. Do we have any mics in the house? Any Justins? All right. So, my talk is Living Off the Land, named in honor of this year's DerbyCon evolution theme. It's going to be about sustainable attacking, essentially, how you can exploit your infrastructure once you have a foothold without killing the golden goose. So, first of all, who I am. My name is Adam Reiser. I'm a security research engineer with Cisco's Advanced Security Initiatives Group. I do primarily red team and application security work. All opinions presented here are my own. And what is this? This is a composite of several red team engagements from 2018. So this is this current work. It's been authorized for disclosure. The target is going to be the fictitious SEGCOM Enterprises network. And throughout this talk, I will be discussing several tools that I've written, which, needless to say, are for authorized testing and educational purposes only, do not puncture or incinerate. So this is our target, the SEGCOM marketplace. It's a network of several systems that, it sells fresh produce, gardening supplies, farm equipment, basic online storefront. We've been hired to perform a red team pen test, whatever you want to call it, against this corporation. Our objectives in this endeavor are to exploit the SEGCOM network in order to demonstrate the impact to the business. In the course of that, we want to avoid detection by the blue team, because if we're detected, there's no business impact. And we also want to minimize any additional risks posed by our activities, either risks to us or to our employers, the SEGCOM Enterprises Association. Therefore, the two following principles will inform our endeavors. We're going to avoid exploiting for the sake of it, and the less privilege we need to demonstrate a business impact, the better. Number of boxes popped is not a good metric. And we're going to avoid any mass indiscriminate scans or exploit sprays. So here's an extremely simplified overview of the network we're going to be exploiting. Obviously, no actual infrastructure is shown here, just a series of servers. Domain controller, obviously at the top, this is roughly organized from more secure on top to less secure on the bottom. So yeah, domain, that's our last resort. If we can't demonstrate impact using anything else, we're going to go for DA as per standard practice. But ideally, we're going to be able to demonstrate an impact without having that. Since this is a post-exploitation talk, we're starting with an assumed breach of this build server, which I'll explain how we get to in a second. The middle row, Jenkins master, and the EDR or SIM console. The point is that the blue team, our adversary, has endpoint insight and is going to be monitoring our activities. And therefore, we need to be extremely selective in how we go about this. We're going to start with an account, a domain account with no particular privileges that we can assume that we've phished, and we need to be careful to avoid burning those credentials. So before we even touch our target network, before we log into the VPN using our ordinary Alice account that we've phished, we're going to begin with external discovery. Basically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this compendium of very well-known techniques using public data for passive reconnaissance, avoids touching the target infrastructure. Yeah, search engines, who has Shodan, you all know this stuff. The main one I want to talk about that's kind of hot right now is certificate transparency. There's a couple main ones, the Google Transparency Report and cert.sh. You get a tremendous amount of information about infrastructure, many times non-publicly accessible servers behind the corporate firewall. In this case, these are the SEGCOM servers that we're going to be exploring. These are all only one of them has publicly accessible services. This is an actual network that's up, and yeah, if you want to try to knock it down, feel free. Yeah, so you can see they all have valid certificates that I've grabbed from Let's Encrypt, even though they're not publicly accessible. So this is a tremendous resource for just a first step where you don't even have to touch the target infrastructure. But it can only take us so far. So at some point, we're going to need to transition to internal discovery. And again, we're not just running Nmap. We're not going to do any mass scans. We're going to be careful because we only have access to the VPN through these creds that we either have been provided to us, or we can assume that we've phished. Again, it doesn't matter. And the first step, which is really pretty obvious, but again, I see people skip this sometimes, but LDAP utilities, tremendously useful for beginning to enumerate. In this case, we're binding against the user that we have some pretty common search-based people, sedge, maze, com. And right away we can see in this abbreviated list of permissions and groups that this account that we have, Alice, is a developer, does not have a login shell, which is a good thing to know now, because if we'd tried to log into one of the servers that we identified, not only would we get denied, it would also be a chance for the blue team to detect us. An account that doesn't have any business logging in is kind of a red flag. But the most important thing here is we can see the groups that this account is a member of, in particular the Jenkins group. And as you'll recall, we saw a Jenkins server on the cert.sh scan, so that gives us an excellent place to start. Jenkins, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because it's a tremendously popular automation server. It's probably part of the workflow of many of the places you guys work at. It's extremely easy to misconfigure, and development pipelines are notorious for yielding low-hanging fruit. There's many write-ups on exploiting Jenkins. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on all the many and various interesting ways it can be misconfigured, except that the worst case scenario, of course, is completely open server where you can just run scripts directly on the master, just run Groovy code or whatever, just directly on it. That's the worst case scenario, and it's not going to be the case here, however. So we're going to log in using our Alice user and see what we can find. The first thing to notice is what isn't here. In particular, there's no manage Jenkins item in the left-hand column. That indicates we don't have Jenkins admin. We're just an ordinary user on it. You see several folders with jobs. There's a platform check job. This tells us we can probably, if we can build this, then we can probably modify it, and therefore we probably have shell access on at least one server, possibly even the master. Take a look at it. We can see that, yeah, there's a build step that is executing shell commands, and we may even have a limited amount of sudo access. And so our next goal is to determine where exactly we have shell. Where can we run this? Where can we run this job? If we just run it without modifying it and take a look at the console output, we can see this platform check job. It's running DMI decode, yields some information about hardware. DMI is kind of it's an older specification for classifying hardware info. It's been replaced, but it's still in use, and the DMI decode utility is still in place in most Linux distributions, and this will be important, as we'll see in a minute. So where can we run this job? We can see that on this server there are 3 agents configured. The master, as it's always there, build, and the website, www. It's the web server, the storefront, which we saw in the original network infrastructure diagram. More to the point, we can see in the left column the build executor status only has agents for build and www. We apparently cannot run code on the master itself, which makes sense, as we saw it was in the middle secure row, again in that diagram. Maybe we can change that though. Well, no, as it turns out, Alice is missing the agent configure permission, so this Jenkins server is relatively locked down, and we're not actually able to run code wherever we want. But okay, so it's designed to be run on the build server, but can we run it on www? It makes sense. The way you check that is we can just configure the job, restrict where it can be run to only www, and we'll try building it. And unfortunately, we see console output, job failed, and you can guess what happened here pretty easily. We get a sudo prompt, so it's pretty clear that the Jenkins user on www, while it exists, as it was able to log in, it failed to execute sudo. So either it requires a password or it's not configured at all. And of course, the worst case here is we may have gotten caught because we just tried to run sudo on a server that wasn't configured to expect this. So maybe this wasn't a great idea. We need another method to get root, or even to get root on www, although we do have shell on it. So for that, we're going to need privilege escalation on the build server and use that to pivot into a domain account that will let us log into the www server. How do we do that? This brings us to a DMI exploit. This is my favorite part of red teaming. It's custom exploit development. Now, this isn't a vulnerability in DMI decode itself per se. Speaking is hard. This is a site-specific this is a site-specific configuration weakness that takes advantage of the fact that the pseudo configuration on these servers allows you to run DMI decode with any arguments you specify. What I discovered on this engagement is that a crafted DMI table allows you arbitrary file write, and therefore pseudo DMI decode gives you root escalation. So what does this look like? The conditions to execute this attack are a sudo L. We need to be able to run DMI decode, and we need to be able to specify arguments that we of our choosing. No password isn't required, but in this case, we kind of need it for using it on Jenkins. So what does this actually look like? The exploit is very simple. DMI decode is designed to read the system hardware information, and the way it does that by default is it just accesses dev mem and looks for certain patterns. In particular, the _SM underscore is one kind of magic word that begins the header for the BIOS. And what we can do here is this tool that I wrote called DMI write will craft a DMI file based on an input file. And when that file is read by DMI decode, it will output a DMI file. It has a dump bin option that allows you to dump the output of it. And when that Trojan file is dumped, it will be identical to the file that we passed in the input. With one annoying exception, it's prepended by a header, which the most I've been able to do with it is make 32 null bytes at the beginning. It's annoying, but fortunately, it doesn't actually interfere with all avenues of privilege escalation. So that's what the exploit looks like. It generates a DMI file containing a table that we can then use. We can load that onto our target system using some manner, and we can then use DMI decode to read that as a memory file and dump it to an arbitrary file we specify using our sudo access. And what that looks like is, notice now, instead of being on the our home server, we're on the build server, or I'm sorry, the target server. We run DMI decode, no sysfs. That may or may not be something you need to use depending on the version of DMI decode you have. It just tells us we want to use the -d temp crafted.dmi as our memory device rather than reading from dev mem or from sysfs. And our dump bin is etc passwd. And of course, what we've done in our Trojan version of that we've created, what is in crafted.dmi, is we've set the Jenkins user to UID 0, so it's root equivalent. Now, of course, there's many ways to leverage a arbitrary file write into root access, and some of them are more detectable than others. Again, that's kind of something that's site-specific, and you'll need to examine what kind of countermeasures you are going to be up against and what's least likely to be detected. Of course, you can also add SSH keys and all that kind of thing. I just looked up dirty cowpox for ideas, since it is kind of a notorious file write. Well, so this is what it looks like when you have properly exploited the vulnerability. There's two FW write calls. The first one will write a number of bytes of the file, and the second one will look like it failed That's just because it's trying to write an empty header to it, and it'll just write 32 nulls instead. So we do that, we log back in, because again, kind of annoyingly, we need to re-log in to actually see the results of the UID change. We do ID as the Jenkins user, and we can see we're UID 0, where we're Jenkins, but we have root permissions. Kind of just a note on the what it looks like technically when you are running the DMID code. This is obviously a stack trace at the write dump time when we're overwriting etc past WD. You can see that's our dump file, and to get there we came from DMI table dump. We're dumping a DMI table that begins with new line root. That's not suspicious at all. The new line actually is really important to make sure that etc past WD is going to be interpreted properly, even though it's kind of malformed at this point, beginning with 32 null characters. And here's the second dump that, yeah, is the 32 nulls, and I've not found a way to avoid this. So it does limit the number of ways you can actually escalate. Set UID is primarily what's kind of off limits to us at this point. If anyone has a way that we can make a binary that, yeah, it's probably not feasible. It begins with nulls. Anyway, we're going to enumerate whether this is actually possible on our target system. We'll just modify the job sudo L to see if we actually can specify any arguments we want on here. This is a tactic that I love, post-build steps on Jenkins servers, just because it lets you run shell commands, and there's not a history maintained on it, although obviously it can be monitored in other ways, and of course the sudo is going to be logged. Anyway, the console output, as it turns out, it's like this, and we see that we can indeed run DMID code with any arguments we want, so conditions are green. All systems go. So our modified build steps look like this. We fetch our Trojan to DMI file from some drop server. We run the command, and we remove the evidence that we were there. Console output looks the same as it did when we ran it in our test. etc past WD FW write. So now at this point, Jenkins user should be root equivalent on the build server, which means that we're root equivalent. So now we can just go nuts and loot the server and move on to the next step, right? Well, not so fast. Yeah, there's no passwords in etc shadow. All the private keys are encrypted. Because of PCI DSS and this general awareness of the risks of keeping secrets on disk, it's becoming less and less common for people to do that. So we're going to need to up our game. We're not always at just you can just loot and get out. We're going to actually need to run some kind of code on here that is going to persist and either Trojan a binary, keylog, something. We're going to need to leave some kind of persistence on here to get anywhere. And this just got worse because when we check the process list, we can see evidence, clear evidence of HIDs. We've got 2 endpoint agents that are running on here. We can see OSS sec agent D and Rapid7, shout out IR agent. So this server is clearly going to tattle on us to the EDR SIM console if we muck about on it. And if it goes dark, then we're on a clock. And again, one of the other things that we could just run up against here that could set off alarm bells is file integrity. If we start modifying files, and in fact, since we modified past WD, we could already have been caught at this point. So both speed and stealth are critical from this point onward. So this brings us to a topic I like to call offensive forensics. Honestly, just because it sounds cool and badass. But seriously though, It's because of the remarkable overlap between red and blue team technologies. When you think about it, these incident response toolkits like GRR or whatever, rapid response, they're essentially just C2 infrastructure that's not optimized for stealth. So this brings us to one of my favorite tools for just quickly going onto a box and seeing what active processes are doing, which is going to be familiar to many of you, strace. It's because it's tremendously useful for targeting memory and just whatever a particular process is doing. You can get a remarkable amount of insight into it just beyond encryption. Now, the weaknesses of this are going to be that, if someone's logging in with SSH keys or one-time passwords, it's not going to be quite as helpful, because unlike a debugger, it's entirely passive, at least if we use the off-the-shelf version. I like to call strace the Swiss Army microscope of process inspection. Microscope is distinct from knife because, again, it's passive. We're not going to be able to just start cutting up the process and actually man-in-the-middling it. Ptrace under the hood, again, not any revelations there. And advantages of using strace is just your first stop for examining running processes and grabbing secrets from them. It's mature, stable, and well supported, and it's frequently present by default. Cons of using it looks suspicious. If you're running strace and the SSH process ID is in the process list on it, that is kind of an alarm bell. Again, off-the-shelf strace is only useful for a passive interception, and the flip side of being mature, stable, and well supported is that it's well known, the risks of it now, and it's frequently denied by either the Yammer security module, or if you're unfortunate enough to be up against SE Linux, it's also deniable by that. Let's take a look at just a basic use case of strace for reading SSH passwords. Again, the context for this is we're trying to pivot from the build server that we have root on. We're trying to gain a domain account that is logging into here, that's also logging into another server so that we can actually get off this box and do something useful that's going to demonstrate business impact. So we run strace against the SSH process, the PID that specifies there. We want to trace all read syscalls, and we want to follow the child processes that the SSH daemon spawns. This is very important because many processes aren't going to just handle everything on their own. When we do this, we need to be prepared for an avalanche of output. We're going to see many, many lines of useless garbage and generate a fair amount of network traffic in the process, so be on guard against that as well. Eventually we come across a username here, the Osiris account, which will turn out to be a service account that we actually want. And if we look at the second line here, we can see that we've actually grabbed the password for it. It's a success. Let's go back to LDAP, and we're going to use this account that we've just got with the creative password of Hunter2 to enumerate the permissions for this account, and we can see that its description is storefront updater service account. So we can probably log into the storefront server, and we can also see that we have login shell bin bash, so we should finally have shell access. I'm going to take a step back here before we do that and talk about PS evasion, because what actually happened when we did this is the endpoint insight tools that we saw were running, they noticed a unique process, and not only that, a suspicious process, strace, and we got caught. So before we even tried to use this, blue team was on to us, they cut off our access, and we got booted off. So I'm going to talk about a kind of elementary PS evasion technique that I've employed successfully on red teams. It's not anything new or revolutionary, but it's really kind of a good thing to have in your tool bag, and I'm going to talk about how it can be applied to strace in particular. It's hard coding arguments into binaries. Again, it's not not anything revolutionary, but it's remarkably easy to do, and it can go a surprisingly long way. Of course, you will still get caught by SE Linux or Yum or anything that's actually looking at what's going on under the hood. This is a tool that I wrote called Stealth Trace, and it's based on, this is just the strace.c. The remarkable thing about strace, and this is, again, just straight off the strace GitHub, is it almost seems built for this kind of tool, because right inside the main function, there's just a nested init function using just argc, argv. So it's remarkably easy to just allocate our own memory, make fake arguments, and just run init. Just make a statically compiled strace with hard-coded arguments for the site that you're targeting, the server that you're running this on, with the PID built right into the code. And it's remarkably stable. Been able to compile it on Ubuntu and have it run on Red Hat. It's been stable, statically compiled. strace is very nice, mature software. And just the before and after of what it looks like without modified. You've got the specified option for the process, and you're looking at read calls. Afterwards, we've also renamed it to something a little more innocent looking, and that's what the PS output looks like. Yeah, we're just running top. All quiet here. But yeah, you are still going to get you're still going to get busted by any real detection capabilities. And again, the worst case is SE Linux. In this case, I've got a demo of what happens when SE Linux deny ptrace has been configured, and we're gathering those logs centrally, the audit log, and what happens when you actually try to run this. Even as root, you get strace, attach, ptrace attach, that's the SSH process ID, permission denied. Okay, so it failed, but no big deal, right? Except here's what's happening on the blue team admins. Oh shit. Blue team wins. Okay, so that wasn't a great idea. And yeah, what they were doing basically is they had OS query and all that. So head-on attack, we got caught. The point I want to emphasize here is that blue team is always going to win if they know what they're doing and they're as good as you because they were here first. That's why, as attackers, we constantly need to be upping our game. I like to think of it as 3 levels of evasion. Head-on attack with no evasion, you're going to get caught. Use an appropriate level of evasion based on your reconnaissance of the target site. That's a success. If you use too much evasion, you get caught in your own web of deception, and that doesn't work out so well either. So again, it's about being site-specific and appropriate for the target environment. So what's our end game here? We started with a foothold on the build server using a phished account. We escalated to root, and then we captured a domain account that allowed us to log into the storefront. So our privilege escalation, and we got root on the build server, and we migrate to the storefront server. What's our end game from here? As you may have guessed, based on storefront, one of the highest impact, lowest risk ways to exploit access of this kind is client-side skimming. The MageCart threat actor is the most notorious one, and it's not just for credit card info. It's useful as an attacker for just any kind of client-side access of credentials. If you need to pivot from one server to another, client-side, there's just not enough ways to sing the praises of client-side attacks, because not only is the captured data known to be current, it's exfiltrated from outside the corporate network, unless they're using a full tunnel VPN, but who does that? As 3 notable companies have discovered lately, client-side JavaScript exfiltration is incredibly dangerous, hard to detect, and just just nasty. It's almost unfair. So object lessons for this. Don't exploit for the sake of exploiting. That's a good way to get caught. And if you get caught, there goes your business impact. CEO's laptop trumps domain admin every single time. Use an appropriate level of evasion for your target site, your target system. It's going to be based on heuristics like how mature you think the target is. Do they actually have a real EDR? Are they still stuck on SIM? Are they just ad hocing everything? Again, there's no business impact if you get caught. And if you must take trophies, make them POCs, not boxes. Cool hacks are better than number of boxes every single time. And that's pretty much it. Because you folks are so shy and retiring, I suggest any questions that you're afraid to ask here. Direct them to either my email or my Twitter account. Not that I ever actually tweet, but I could in theory. I have one. But in the meantime, any questions from the audience for real? All right, thank you very much.